Good morning and welcome to the fourth installment in our succession planning series. Today we're talking about the search, recruiting, external candidates, and compensation trends. We're delighted to bring back Carrie Millard and Lindsay Steinberg of Millard Consulting, but before we introduce them, want to cover a few notes. Today's webinar is being recorded, which means that you will have access to this webinar at the end of this forum. It will come to the inbox that you used to register. If you are in need of live captions, please take a look at the black bar at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. If you need to adjust the captions, click the caret. If you have content-related questions for this forum, please use the Q&A box. If you click that box and type in your question, it will be addressed during the Q&A portion of this forum. If you're looking through there and you see questions that you definitely want to hear the answers to, please go ahead and upvote those questions. It helps me prioritize the Q&A portion of the event. If you have technical concerns, please place those issues in the chat box. The chat box is being monitored for issues like volume, closed captioning, things like that. We also love to have your comments, your cheers, feedback for the presenters in the chat box, so feel free to use it for that as well. At the end of the forum, you will receive, in about a week, you will receive an email with follow-up materials, including a Dropbox link. And right at the end of the forum, you will see a survey opportunity that will pop up on your screen that gives you an opportunity to tell us how we're doing. With that, I'd like to introduce Carrie and Lindsay. Carrie is the founder and CEO of Millard Consulting. She's a respected authority on nonprofit board governance, planning, and fundraising. Her 27-year career in the nonprofit sector includes roles in public relations, fundraising, and executive leadership. She is also an elected official, and she serves as Plain Township trustee. Carrie has a master's degree from Indiana University and a bachelor's degree from The Ohio State University. She also has a certificate in nonprofit board consulting from BoardSource. Lindsay has been a senior director of client engagement with Millard Consulting since 2015. She is a respected leader in nonprofit management, board governance, fundraising, and planning. She's client-centered with a strong training and communication skill and extensive experience in working in a variety of sectors. Happy to bring to the stage Carrie and Lindsay.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Danielle, for that introduction. Nice to see everybody. We are going to bring up the slides here and get started. So we are really honored to continue this series. And as Danielle had said, this is the fourth one. And as a reminder about our team, we do these workshops and webinars like this because our mission is to build the capacity of nonprofit organizations and the individuals who serve them. So at any time throughout the session today, feel free to put questions in the chat and to reach out at any time after this. But we'll start as we want to get to know you a little bit. We're going to start with a poll question. And as we're thinking about candidates, I want you to think about you and your organization and your board. Do you think they have a higher comfort level bringing in a certain type of a successor? For instance, do you think your board has a preference to bring in only internal candidates, only external candidates, or no, their comfort level is the same? Or I don't know, you haven't thought about this question yet. As you're answering this poll question, Lindsay and I find that this ends up becoming quite the topic of conversation. And some people have really strong views one way or the other in terms of you must have external or no, just hire from within. So we'll see how you all responded. No, so just over half the comfort level is the same. And interesting, 15% yes external, yes internal, and then 15% I don't know. So thank you for answering that question. We're going to have two more quick polls for you. But I want you to think about, as you think about doing succession planning in your organization, having this conversation about internal versus external will be helpful. So the next question for you to consider is, do you or your board, can you name 3 to 5 peer organizations that may have leaders that can be recruited? So yes, no, maybe, or I don't know. So can you name 3 to 5 peer organizations that may have leaders that could be recruited? So when the time comes and you will be in an active search mode, do you have ideas here? Yes, no, maybe, or I don't know. Oh, good. So just under half said yes. And some maybes and I don't know. The reason we ask this question is it's, again, as you do succession planning, thinking about who are your peer organizations that could be tapped if and when the time comes for a search. So just about half are able to answer that. So again, this is another really good conversation at the board level. And then our next one, okay, that question was about peer organization. This is about aspirant organizations, meaning organizations that your organization aspires to be like. Maybe these organizations have grown and excelled in ways that align with your goals. So could you name 2 or 3 aspirant organizations? So yes, no, maybe, I don't know. So this poll before was about peer organizations. This one's about aspirant. So you can say, yes, we want to have a similar trajectory as these organizations. Great. This one is more. This was 60% said yes. Oh, that's really good. 7% said no, 27% said maybe. So as you have these conversations with your board about peer organizations, include this aspirant organization as well. I'm glad so many of you had said yes, because again, these could be organizations that your board might want to tap when the time comes for recruitment. Wonderful. Thank you for answering those. One more. Does your board follow a standardized policy and or practice for regularly benchmarking chief executive compensation? So when does the board have an operation for this? Is there a standardized policy or practice to regularly benchmark chief executive compensation? Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. And we'll talk more about this in the session today, how important this is, especially in this current economic climate. Okay, so this was more evenly split between yes and no. So just under half said yes, 35% said no, and then maybe I don't know. So again, we'll talk about this one more as we proceed with our slides. But you will want, all of you on the webinar today, you're all going to want to be able to answer yes to this and to have this operationalized in your organization and at the board level. Great. Thank you guys for answering those polls.
Great. So this is just a quick reminder that the original succession planning assessment is hyperlinked and remains live. I believe it's in the invite that goes out for each of these sessions. So that's a live assessment that you can take at any time and pull down from. And there's also a PDF version of that assessment in the Dropbox that you can use and bring to your board. So a quick level set, just a recap of some of the things we discussed in past sessions. A couple of reminders. First of all, succession planning is an extension of strategic planning, and it is a board responsibility. Just a reminder that this is a board-led, and one of the top responsibilities of the board is that strategic planning. Also, that succession planning is not synonymous with an executive search and a transition. Succession planning is a much more proactive, all-encompassing process, and the search is just one piece of a larger process. The third is that succession planning is best accomplished when leadership is stable and the organization is not yet in a transition phase or an active search process. Again, speaking to the proactive nature here, a lot of organizations think our leader's not going anywhere anytime soon, so we don't need to think about this, but it's best to do when the leadership is stable and you're not in a crisis situation. And the last one is that not all departures are planned, which is why we start with emergency preparedness when we do succession planning to ensure there's an emergency plan in place for any unplanned departure. Some transition scenarios. So we have a handful here. There's retirement, resignation with advance notice, resignation with very little notice, sabbatical, termination, and leave of absence. The last one would be the emergency of death. So this is just a reminder that there are multiple scenarios, and some are planned, some are unplanned, some would require emergency preparedness. Some are positive, some are negative. So, which is why the succession plan needs to make sure that it encompasses and covers all. Okay, so we're going to talk about search considerations, specifically when thinking about external candidates. So a couple of things here. First, the two most feared words in any boardroom is search committee. And we know this is because, boards understand all the work that's involved, which is why it's, a feared word. It's a feared thought to take that on. Board members, as we know, nonprofits are working as volunteers, so it's a high time commitment and it's high stakes for the organization. They know, picking the next leader has huge implications, of course, for the community, the partners, and the work. And that's a lot to take on for the board. So the unknown is scary, which is why it's the two most feared words. But the second most feared words is succession planning. And we're finding this, the more succession plans we do for different clients, there's so much fear and anxiety around even the proactive planning process. There's a lot of reluctance, especially for the current executive directors and CEOs, to take on succession planning. It seems like, especially in the nonprofit world, there's kind of this stigma around what does doing a succession plan present to the public and to our partners and to the donors. Everyone's going to think that I'm leaving, right away. And so we really had to do a lot of educating and working with clients and really the nonprofit community to explain that this, again, is a proactive process. It doesn't mean anyone's going anywhere, but this is a piece of strategic planning. This is a role of the board. It is really just about mitigating risk for the organization. Some organizations that we've seen seem to think they may have a succession plan, but they don't. So we've seen an organization that in their head they may know who the successor is. Maybe they've talked to that person about being a potential successor, but that's not a plan. A plan has to be communicated. It has to be documented. And ultimately, you can't expect your board to take on and support a transition without having a plan and something documented to help guide them. So having a succession plan in your mind is not going to be helpful in a crisis. The second one here is it will serve the organization well to make decisions now about search parameters, the use of a search firm, the authority of a search committee, the role of the staff in the search process, et cetera, without being in that pressure cooker of being in a search. So, we actually put together a full assessment for clients around each of these items because all of these decisions really should be made up front. We'll discuss them in more detail later on in the presentation, but number one being the role and authority of a search committee. That's the biggest decision, and it sounds simple, but really, is it the search committee that's making the decision on the hire? Is it the board that's voting on it? Where does the authority lie and where does the authority end? So that the role and authority of the search committee itself is a big piece of it. What decisions can they make and what are their limits? The composition of the committee, who's going to sit on that committee? Is it going to be all board led? Are you going to have external stakeholders, internal staff leadership sitting on the committee as well? And then what is the role of the current executive director or CEO going to be in that process? And then beyond the search process itself, what will their role be in the transition and how long will they overlap? So those are all really important things to discuss, and we'll get more into detail with those later.
And Lindsay, I'll just add there, we always feel really bad for the incoming chief executive when these things don't go well, right? Because then they're coming into a situation in a new role and they have no idea if there's been, disruption or disagreement or sometimes, vehement disagreement. and dysfunction because these things were not decided in advance. So it really set the new leader up for a really difficult situation to walk into.
Number 3 is that executive searches should not be passive. There is a discrete and active recruitment phase. And board members, they should have a known list of organizations and individuals that they can pull from for identifying talent, but there is a very specific active recruitment phase. So to me, this is 2 pieces. One, you all answered the poll question. Are there aspirant organizations or leaders that you can think of and list? That's great, and document those. And when we do succession planning for our clients, we survey that question, we interview for that question, and we try to get a running list started of organizations and individuals that could be potential. But then the active recruitment phase in a search itself is going to be that discrete time period in the search. And that's going to be current state, right? So who is available and qualified and interested in this moment in time, right? And you can pull from that list as a resource, but there's going to be a very active phase. I was actually talking to a woman who works for a search firm, an executive, and they quite literally call it the launch of their recruitment. So they have a day, a time where they actually launch this search and recruitment phase of their work. So it is not passive.
And then number 4, as Lindsay was talking about searches and search firms, know the range of search consultants and firms and their services in your area, in your sector, so that the board fully understands their options and the costs when the time comes. And we will talk about this one in more detail as we go through the webinar today. But again, knowing this information in advance, because not all departures are planned, will really help the board make good decisions. And it is a wide variety. It doesn't have to be a full service search firm. It can be a much simpler process. But again, knowing what their options are helps to mitigate some of the anxiety, fear, trepidation that happens when a departure occurs, especially if it's not a planned departure. And then number 5, we touched on this in the poll question. So chief executive and senior leadership team, but primarily chief executive, those compensation and benefit packages should be benchmarked. And it's not just a best practice that, from BoardSource or from our experience at Miller Consulting, it's actually an IRS compliance requirement. They now ask that question on the Form 990. How was compensation determined? What data was used to make sure that the compensation is in line? Obviously, there are examples of egregious levels of compensation, which is why the IRS now requires substantiation language in the Form 990. But having a practice where every year, pick a month, is it every December? Is it every May? That data is looked at when it's time to look at chief executive compensation. And, when we had the poll question, we touched on, this larger economic climate that we are all working in, and wages have gone way up. And so if you're not benchmarking on a regular basis, you may be way out of step with current market rate, way underpaying. And then if a departure happens, you may not be prepared. And that's what number 6 is, right? Without time to correct and get compensation more on par with market rates, then and the departure happens, you may, as an organization, have to pay considerably more for the new hire coming in. And Lindsay and I and our team, we've seen this, right? The new person coming in is making $50,000 more a year than the person who's leaving, because the compensation never kept up with market forces. And so far better to understand now where the compensation falls, make incremental changes over time so that the organization doesn't have to absorb a massive increase in compensation in one fiscal year. And then this one on staff. So compensation, and then thinking about in the search process, this role of the staff. And Lindsay touched on this in terms of the search parameters, but how important it is to have staff voice involved. They have a deep knowledge of the organization. They have a keen awareness of the type of leader that the organization needs. And anytime that we see board members kind of sideline the staff, minimize input from the staff, and the board, excuse me, the board just goes in with their knowledge, but also their perceptions of the organization, we find that the search or the process is not as informed as it should be, that the board is really missing this key voice. So understanding their role is really important. So let's talk a little bit more about talent, and in particular, identifying external talent. So again, let's go back to these questions we asked you in the poll. I want you to think really, give yourself time, reflective time to think, okay, who are our peers? Who has a similar budget size? Who has a similar staff size? Who has a similar geographic reach? Who is operating in the same sector, excuse me, or a subsector? Who is serving the same population or a similar population? Who has a similar program mix? And, in Franklin County, there are 10,000 nonprofits. In Central Ohio, including the contiguous counties, there are 15,000 nonprofits. So thinking holistically about your peers is a really important exercise for many, many reasons. When you think about your place in the community, when you think about the need that you're filling, when you think about marketing and fundraising and planning, all the things. But in regard to identifying talent, do you have a good sense of who these peer organizations are? And then who is leading those organizations at the chief executive level, but also at the senior staff level? Maybe there's a chief program person at one of these organizations that is really an exceptional leader. Maybe they want to be a chief executive someday. So getting your head around who the peers are, and that can be here in Central Ohio. Those peers can be in a larger region. They can be in other states. But who do you think is akin to the work that you do? So those are your peers. And then let's talk more about these aspirant organizations. Who do you want to aspire to be? Not you personally, but your organization aspire to be. And so these are the organizations that maybe are reaching more people. Maybe they're raising more money. They expanded their impact. They have an exceptional culture. Their leaders are thought leaders in the sector, or they're achieving, really high achieving, high performing, positive outcomes. And when you think about your organization, you think about strategic planning, these are the ones that you say, in 3 to 5 years, I would like our organization to be operating like these guys, right? Like these organizations over here. I'd like to see our outcomes achieve, similar performance metrics. I'd like our culture to be like them. And so again, just like with the peer organizations, who's leading them at the chief level, but who's leading them at the senior staff levels? And these aspirant organizations might be in a much larger geographic region. They may be in a totally different part of the country. But again, a powerful conversation for you to have with your board to say, here are some peers, here are some aspirant organizations. What can we learn from them? And when the time comes, are there leaders here that we can tap? Now, let's talk a little bit more about thought leadership. So we talked about peers, we talked about aspirant organizations, but outside of those organizations, I want you to think about people. Who in the community has an elevated profile and voice, even if they're not in your sector? So maybe you are in health and human services, but there's someone in your community who maybe is an arts leader, and you really find them to be thoughtful. You find that you align with their values, and you really see them as a trusted person, who has an elevated profile. So even if it's outside of your sector, who has a voice that you think, oh my gosh, that person is really really strategic or really thoughtful. And so that's a name that you can think of. Who in your community is a rising star? Maybe they've received recognition. Maybe they just got a 40 under 40 award from Business First. Maybe they've been, tapped as a future leader, as a person of promise. Who is a rising star? Who is up and coming that you think, I really want to watch the career of this person. I can see in 5 to 7 years, this person really playing a key leadership role in our community. What about the larger region, outside of Central Ohio, maybe even outside of the Midwest, that is someone who's really well respected, is trusted, is admired, again, is someone that you admire, and maybe you read, maybe there's someone who blogs and you read their blog all the time. Maybe there's someone who speaks at conferences and you always find yourself going to their sessions when you go to a conference. What about that person? And then lastly, nationally, who should be on your radar? Is there someone in your sector or even outside of your sector that you think, wow, that person is really engaging? And even if that person may not be a candidate, is that someone that you go to say, we're doing succession planning. I'd love your advice on some potential candidates for our organization to consider. So thought leadership. The next thing that we want to touch base on is leadership profile. So we've talked about organizations that might have leaders that you can tap. We've talked about thought leaders locally and larger. But now I want you to think about the profile of the leader when it comes time to recruit and time to replace your chief executive. Do you want a leader who is strong in the core competencies of leadership, or is strong in the area of expertise of your organization? So what does this mean? Let's say if you're an arts organization, do you want someone who has an MFA, who understands the arts? Do you want someone who's been a curator to become your leader? Or no, they don't have to have a deep expertise. They don't have to have an MFA or have a PhD and be a curator. No, we really need someone who's a strong administrator or a really strong planner or fundraiser or finance person. And these are big conversations to have at the board level. I promise you'll get all sorts of opinions, but Lindsay and I see this come up time and again. Does the strength need to be in the area of expertise? Do they need to have a degree or a license or a credential? Do they have to have an MSW if you're a social work organization or a human services organization or not? Lindsay, do you want to add anything here to this? Because this is such a big question for an organization to wrestle with.
Yeah, when we added this question into our succession planning interviews, we doubled the length of time of this conversation can go so many ways. But I think there's not necessarily a right answer, but certainly important to be on the same page as a board. But if you open it up in some senses to the core competencies, not to say that there are tons and tons of leaders with all these core competencies, but if you move outside of having to have a certain licensure or expertise, that aspirant organization and peer conversation can get broader as well, right? Then you're looking at leaders that can maybe move sectors, which we see happen a lot. So one, it can open up your pool in some instances. And also we've seen the example where an organization has pendulum swung from having maybe a leader with certain core competencies, and their culture was really built around the competencies of that leader. And then when they left, this pendulum swung and they really wanted this expert in the field who came in with all his expertise in one particular area, but maybe not with the leadership competencies, which then really throws off balance the culture of the organization because they really had been built on one thing. And then you're bringing in something that maybe looks quite different. So all different kinds of repercussions here, but definitely an interesting conversation and one that's important to have.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's an organization that Lindsay and I have worked with, and the leader is highly affected. I mean, he is beloved. And he did not have expertise in the area of the organization. He came from a totally different sector. And in fact, in one of the conversations with a board member for that organization, I really chuckled because the board member said to me, you know, this person never would have been named in a succession plan. Totally different sector, but oh my goodness, how effective and accomplished and revered this person is. And so Lindsay's exactly right. We've added these questions because when we only think about health and human services or arts or hospitals and healthcare, we know we really limit ourselves. And if we're only thinking about those degrees and licensures and expertise and qualifications, we may be missing the ideal applicant. And so, yes, this is a big board discussion.
And I think boards have agreed, in the example you're talking about, Carrie, they've agreed that, having the core competencies might be first and foremost, but there's still an appreciation, an understanding of the organization's work, right? It's not a complete outsider, but they don't have to be an expert in that field. They may not have come from that field specifically, but of course you're going to want someone to come in that has an understanding and an appreciation for the work that the organization does.
That's exactly right. Right. That's exactly right. But it's an understanding and appreciation for the work is very different from a license degree, all the things. That's exactly right. Yeah. So core competencies and leadership profiles. So what are we referring to? So in session 2, we talked a lot about the need for a leadership profile in addition to the job description, and we discussed core competencies. So for those of you who did not see session 2, again, all of these webinars in this forum series are on YouTube. You can go back and look at that. But the essence is, what are the attributes, the qualities that should be considered beyond just job description skill sets, right? And here we want to also touch on DE&I and mitigating implicit bias in candidate evaluation. So beyond, what do you want to look for in a leader, right? What are those leadership attributes? What are the qualities that you're looking for? Lindsay just talked about culture. We see this time and again with our clients, organizations that have a certain culture or a positive culture, or frankly, a negative culture. And what is the culture that you want to cultivate in your organization? And so thinking about these leadership qualities and attributes are going to be directly related to the type of culture that you cultivate in your organization. And then, of course, demographics often come up. Age, gender, race, all sorts of elements of the human person when you're looking at candidates. But we have to remember, implicit bias exists. And so when you're thinking about evaluating candidates, what will you put in place to mitigate any of those biases? And how will DE&I inform your process? Lindsay and I just talked about this yesterday with another client, and how important this is, but also getting it right from an authentic standpoint. What does your organization truly believe? What are your values? How do you want your leader, your next chief executive, to personify those values? And getting very clear and very, truly authentic in that, and not just kind of a check the box or kind of a pro forma or perfunctory metric. I don't know, Lindsay, if you want to add anything there.
Just to say that, I think these things are important to consider too, if and when you decide to look at a search firm. And how do they bring this into their process too? How do they let DEI inform the process? How do they create their candidate pools to kind of match this profile that's been created? So, those are all really important things to understand from a search firm perspective too.
And then ultimately, what will the compensation and benefits look like, right? If you're going to be recruiting external candidates, you got to think about your benefit package. And we'll talk more about compensation here in a bit, but we are kind of, frankly, we shouldn't be surprised, but we are surprised often at the compensation of leaders in our community. And in addition to compensation, it's the benefit packages. I mean, we still work with organizations who don't have health insurance plans for their employees. Never mind 401k or, IRA retirement plans or short-term disability plans or group life insurance plans or, paid maternity and paternity leave or, that larger compensation package, including benefits. What is the current state of what you offer your organization today? And will that package be attractive to the type of leader that you want to recruit tomorrow? And if it's not, what incremental changes can you make to get that benefit package better and more competitive? So here's the compensation slides. So this is based on OANO. OANO is the Ohio Association of Nonprofit Organizations. They do a salary survey every couple of years. And so this is the most recent OANO data. For executive directors in the state of Ohio, the average salary is $116,682, and the median is $100,500. And then the OANO salary survey data breaks it down. So specifically for executive directors, and we pulled a couple of data points here. In health and human services, the average salary is $117 and the median is $104. In Central Ohio, the average salary is $130, the median is $112. For organizations with 50 to 99 employees, the average is $146, the median is $132. For organizations with budgets of 2.5 to 4.99 million, the average is 131, the median is 122. So you can see, you can slice the OANO data by geographic region, Central Ohio, by sector, health and human services, by number of employees, and by budget size. So here's a quick snapshot of these data points. Now, this most recent OANO salary survey data was done during the pandemic. And so we all know what has happened to wage growth and compensation over the last couple of years. So what we do when we look at this OANO data is we average all these data points. So all these data points here, we come up with an average, and then we multiply it by a factor of either 10% or 15% to account for the fact that from a macroeconomic standpoint, wage growth has gone up exponentially. Inflation has gone up exponentially. So the average of all those data points was 121,000 times a factor of 10% would be 133, or a factor of 15% would be roughly 140. So if your current chief executive salary is 92,500, then you are far below, anywhere from 28,000 to 47,000 below this benchmark, which means that that salary of 92,000 falls under the 25th percentile on some measures and is closer to 50% on others, which we would say is, grossly underpaid. So if this is what your organization looks like, and an unplanned departure happens tomorrow, and you need to immediately launch into a search, your organization may have to absorb a $50,000 increase in compensation to hire someone today to replace the person who leaves. The OANO data, OANO salary survey data, has all positions in the organization, not just chief executive, but we're focusing just on that today. And then we touched on this benefit package. Does your organization has health, vision, dental, life, disability, or other supplemental insurance? Is there an annual increase in a bonus structure, process, or procedure baked into the organization? Do you have a retirement plan? What is the PTO meaning paid time off schedule? Do you have wellness programs? Are you allowed to do remote work? Would your chief executive have a car allowance? Or is there travel and mileage reimbursements? Does your chief executive get memberships paid? You know, professional association memberships or even social memberships? Is there a deferred compensation option? So these are, again, are for all, for you and your board to talk about. What do we have today? What is current state? What might we need tomorrow? And then how do we get there? Because I will tell you, these types of benefits are expected. And organizations who are not keeping up are going to have a really, really hard time attracting the leader that you want and the leader that your organization needs.
Great. So the next piece we're going to dive into a little bit more deeply is the roles and responsibilities of the search committee, search firm, and what that looks like. So first is the management of the search itself. And there are a spectrum of options for running an executive search, from being on one far end, being fully board-led without support, to retaining a full service search firm. So there's a little, I think of it as like a stair step of at least 4 options here. So one is the board manages the search, often with a board member who may have some HR expertise, and they're doing all the screening, the interviewing, in the process from start to finish. The second would be to work with a consultant who can help do some of that screening of the resumes, conduct those first phone interviews, do some reference checks, and be a resource in a consultant type role. Then you could hire a recruiter as a third option, who would actively seek and screen candidates more deeply based on parameters that were given to them. So they're doing more of the recruiting for the interviewing in that portion of the process and taking that off of the board. And then the fourth option, of course, is retaining a search firm for full service support from that, ensuring the job description and the profile is up to date and accurate, to placement and onboarding. And interesting, and some of the search firms we've spoken with recently, just to understand their process, they're actually kind of adding more into this full service than I had initially seen. So that they'll stay around for coaching, onboarding of the new person, ensuring that from a time period after that person is placed in the role, that they have an executive coach and an onboarding support and things of that nature. So I feel like this full service is really even going deeper than maybe it had in the past. So the search committee. So there are really important decisions around the search committee and what that looks like. And we talked a little bit earlier about the role and the authority, which is part of it. But first, the membership, the composition of the committee itself, who is going to chair the committee. So, we suggest at the very least upfront going through and saying, what is the general makeup of the committee that we're looking at? First of all, the size, typically 7 to 9 is a recommended size. You don't want to be too big, but you also don't want to be too small where there's not representation. So what does the committee membership look like? Is this going to be fully board-led? Are you going to pull your board members to fill the committee? Are you going to pull in some staff leadership, so there's staff voice in this process? Or are you going to bring in external stakeholders? So having that laid out, you don't necessarily have to have specific names written down, but important to understand the positions and role that they might play. So also then the criteria, parameters, profile, et cetera, for candidate evaluation. How are you going to evaluate the candidates that you bring in? And how is the search committee going to use that criteria? The third would be committee communication in partnership with the board or the consultant or the recruiter or the search firm, or whichever direction the organization goes. What does that communication look like? What is the committee doing? Who's relaying that back to the board? Who's the main point of contact working with the recruiter or the search firm? So understanding that those lines of communication is important too. And then here again, the committee authority. So is the committee, doing the screening and interviewing and then bringing a recommendation to the full board to then vote and offer and make a hire? Does the committee have full authority, which is not what we recommend, but does the committee have full authority where they're actually offering the candidate without it going to the board? So all of those decisions around authority are really important too. And then again, onboarding support. You don't want to bring in this new person and then the committee disbands and they're kind of left and they feel like they don't have any resources.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll just emphasize that committee authority, we see it more often than you might think about this gap between the search committee thinks they have the authority to make an offer and the board thinks that they don't. And it's just so critical to make sure everyone's on the same page with that.
Yeah. And also, when you're thinking about membership, or not membership, but composition of the committee, some organizations will bring in external stakeholders to sit on that committee. So for example, we've worked with a client who's heavily publicly funded. So they felt like it was only right to have a public representative that was appointed perhaps to sit on that committee because they help fund the organization so much. So in that instance specifically, it's really important that the board, it ultimately is the decision maker, because you want to be really careful with having, outside stakeholders kind of, drive the bus here and make the ultimate decision. So I think if you're going to have external stakeholders, even if you're going to have staff leadership on the committee, that's fine. But then ultimately you're going to want the board to be the decision maker.
That's right. That's right.
So then the role of the outgoing chief executive, something that can also be a little bit sticky. And, we've seen a range of opinions on this too. So depending on the timing and the circumstances of the departure, it's important to think about, will your outgoing leader provide input and support with a variety of things? So first, are they going to help support the job description review and making sure it's accurate and revised? Are they going to help create a leadership profile with those core competencies that we've discussed? Are they going to help identify candidates? Are they going to screen develop the screening criteria, and then would they interview the candidates? Would they help with the onboarding and the new hire training? So there's a range of options here, but it's interesting because it's really important to make sure the board understands what the executive director wants and what's their role to be. We have seen, and there's again a variety of options, but we have seen the executive directors that we work with are not comfortable playing a role in the majority of the things listed here. They really want to be removed. And from what we've worked with, that last one, that being on call for coaching, is the most common that we have seen, where they really feel like they could be more of a support and a kind of a side advisor maybe to the process, but they're not going to be involved in the identification and screening.
And I'll just add real quickly for that, we put in italics for a period of time. That should not be a long period of time. It should be minimal. It's really not fair to the incoming chief executive to have the outgoing chief executive hanging around offering advice for a long time. It's really hard.
And I spoke to a search firm who said they have actually worked with, kind of the opposite of what I just described, where they have had current chief executives sitting on the committee, and how the word that this woman used was awkward, how very awkward it is, and how challenging it is. Because if you have a candidate come through and the current chief executive says that they don't think that candidate's qualified, well, that opinion almost naturally is going to trump the opinions of the other committee members, because they are the person with the most knowledge of the position. So the power dynamic is very, very complicated if the current chief executive is sitting on the committee.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, absolutely.
So then the role of the staff. This is important too. Staff want to feel like they're engaged in the process and that they have a voice. And what that voice looks like can also be quite a range of options. So, administrative support person to the search committee, the consultant, or the firm. Does the staff have a role there? Is a staff person, a leadership person from the organization going to formally serve on the search committee? And if not, will there be a liaison to the staff? So this staff involvement with the search committee is really helpful in the sense that they have a perspective of the role, the workings of the organization that's quite different than a board member would have, or an external stakeholder. But again, this is a committee role. So the committee can help make recommendations to the full board, but the full board decides. So it wouldn't necessarily be the staff person having authority to decide who's chosen, but they have a role in the process by serving on the committee as a resource. There's also the option that staff involvement and has the ability to inform the process and the work of the committee. Do the staff get to interview with the top 2 to 3 candidates? Do they do a meet and greet with the top 2 to 3 candidates? So, we have organizations that feel very, very committed to staff engagement, and they want this to be transparent. And they said, we want all of our staff to be able to at least see the top candidates, which is a fine option, but you still have to think through. So do they have any decision-making authority? Are you going to be formally asking for their feedback? Do they have a vote? Is this just an informal meet and greet where they walk away? And then another consideration here with the meet and greet is you also have to consider the candidates themselves. Oftentimes these candidates are not publicly applying for this position. So to expect that a candidate is going to go on a public forum and do a meet and greet is a risk for them as an individual. So not something that all candidates will be comfortable with. So just important to consider the options here. But I will say that the search firms that we've spoken with, they also are committed to staff involvement. They do a lot of stakeholder interviews up front to make sure they really understand the needs of the organization. They're talking to these leaders. So I think too, that you can also reassure the staff that they will have a voice. It just may be at a different point in the process than they may have initially thought.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll amplify what Lindsay's saying to say, we see this slide, this part go wrong an awful lot. This was many, many years ago, but I had a board member say to me when we asked about staff involvement in a search, the board member actually said to me, why? They're just the hired help. Right. And it was this really kind of negative comment, as you can imagine. But that perception of we are the board, we are making this decision. The help doesn't get to make this decision. And I mean, obviously you can tell that there was a lot going on in that organization, but he really reflected the board's position. This is our decision and our decision only. And in the end, that organization did not make a good hire, as you can imagine. But, even just recently, I sat with a colleague whose organization went through a transition, and she actually said to me, the staff is grieving. Right? This is a very, a search is hard. Lindsay said early on, the two most feared words in a boardroom are search committee. Well, those are the most feared words in a staff room too. And this change of a leadership really impacts the team. It impacts the culture. And so getting this slide right, getting the right involvement in the staff with the board to inform the process is really, really strategically important to do.
And I think too, one thing that we didn't put on the slide, Carrie, but also the role of the staff once the new person is in place, right? So we've seen this as well, where the current executive director actually has in their contract that their associate or next level down person could not leave within a year or so of them leaving, because they were going to be expected to really onboard and help acquaint the new person to the role. So is the staff going to be expected to help onboard and train this new person? That's another important question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're going to transition to our closing now, because we know we want to get to our Q&A. And we always like to close with a quote. And so this was from a chief executive who said to me, the job I interviewed for is not the job I have. And this was an organization that did not do the last slide. The staff did not help inform the process. The staff did not help inform the leadership profile, the job description, the interviews. This was an organization that the board did it in a vacuum with the board's perceptions and knowledge. But what ended up happening is that the board interviewed candidates for a job that the board believed to be accurate. But once this person started, they were like, this is nothing that we talked about, right? This is not the organization. This is not the position that I thought I was entering into. And so we don't want this to happen to your organization. And so that's, all of the slides today will help inform so that this isn't something that your future leader will say after they say yes to the job. And we will now go to Q&A, and we'll have Danielle come back.
Wonderful job, as always. That quote that you put there at the end really hit me. The job that I interviewed for is not the job that I have. And I have heard folks say that before. I feel like it is a common refrain. And so that is really important for boards to be mindful of as they're building out that process. What a great quote to end this conversation with. So folks who are watching today, now's the time to put those questions that you might have for our presenters in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring that box for those questions as we go along. I have some questions for you today. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this active phase of recruiting that you talked about and how this should be a very distinct separate portion from all other work that folks are doing. And can you talk about how a board can kick off this active phase, really express the active portion of it and separate it from other work?
Sure. Do you want to start, Lindsay? Do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay. So let's start with what it's not. So let's start with it's not passive. And what we see, Danielle, all the time is, well, these are the resumes that we got, right? These are the people who have applied, and that's the passive, right? That is X number of people have submitted a resume responding to the job posting. So that's passive. So if we flip it over, the opposite of that active is not just waiting to see who applies, but going out and having conversations. So starting with that list of peer and aspirant organizations, the list of thought leaders. Is there a board member, or is the board member working, Lindsay gave that list of, you can have a consultant, you can have a recruiter, you can have a search firm, or is there a board member with HR expertise? Is there someone who's representing the organization that is making phone calls, that is reaching out to colleagues, that is, saying to their network, we have an opening, we are looking for the next leader, and this is the profile that we're looking for, and actively getting that leadership profile out in their networks, actively having conversations with colleagues, emails, coffee meetings, phone calls, to really try to identify the type of leader and encourage them to apply. If it's purely just passive, the job posting goes up on whatever website and you just receive the resumes in, you are missing this golden opportunity to really find the best leader for your organization. One of our clients right now, the leader of that client was actively recruited. She did not apply for the position. She didn't even consider applying for the position, but multiple people reached out to her and said, I'd love for you to consider this position. And she will, she has told me the first email that she got, she's like, that's not for me. The second, then the third phone call she got, she's like, well, I guess I'll have a cup of coffee and talk to someone about it, right? So she was literally actively recruited. And as she went on those conversations with stakeholders and board members, she realized, like, oh, wow, actually this position is very interesting. So if they had only been passive, she never would have applied. But Lindsay, I'll let you add to that too.
Yeah, well, I think that process you reflected, to me, that people think of it as kind of a for-profit, like a corporate process, right? Where you're recruiting and you're being tagged and things like that. And that's the same thing that can happen in the nonprofit world. But I'll add is that in talking to the search firms about their process, they have a whole bunch of checks before they launch that recruitment. So it was, this is updated, this is right, these interviews happen, and literally they said it's always on a Monday morning and it's at this time, and they literally launch where they start making those phone calls, reaching out on LinkedIn, doing whatever they do in a discrete period of time. So I think it's just making sure all your ducks are in a row and then launching that active search.
Yeah. And those ducks in a row, that's exactly right. Has the board agreed upon compensation and benefits? Has the board agreed upon the leadership profile, right? Have all those decisions been made? So current leader leaves, all those decisions have to be made. Hopefully you've got them documented in the succession plan, but they need to be revisited. Then that active search, we don't want board members just kind of willy-nilly going out there before all those decisions have been made either. Right.
That makes a lot of sense. And getting that active piece out there is really important. The way you defined it of actively going out in search of your next best candidate as opposed to waiting for those folks to come to you is of critical importance. In a sector like ours, and I would imagine this is true across the country, especially for the nonprofit sector, how do we work across our sector collaboratively in finding right folks for the positions? I know that there's sometimes this fear of like pulling a person from here or a competitive type of nature. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, right. I think it's a great question, Danielle. And I think some of the fear and trepidation of an active recruitment is, are we poaching, is an old term that we used to hear, a good person from an organization that we collaborate with, or right, like these are our partners, are they going to be mad at us for stealing their leader? But I think we have to get like poaching and stealing that we need to get that nomenclature out of our minds, right? We have to put that to the past, and we have to think about larger than us, larger than our individual organization. What is the right thing for the community? What is the right thing for the sector? Leaders leave. They do, right? Leaders don't stay at organizations forever. And so we know leaders leave. We know every human being wants growth and development opportunities. And so, there will be a time when the leader of your organization will leave. And whether they go to a partner organization or a peer in your sector, or they go outside of the sector, they're going to leave. And I think we just have to not frame it as we stole this person, and reframe it as we want the best for the larger sector, the larger community, and we want to provide growth and leadership development opportunities for the talent that we have. Because I will tell you, talent leaves our sector all the time. We have individuals leaving the nonprofit and going to for-profit, and we don't want that either. It reminds me of, so BoardSource talks about purpose-driven boards. And, one of the tenets of a purpose-driven board is thinking beyond yourself, beyond your organization. And I think it's similar to this. It's beyond your organization and what's the right thing for the sector, the community, but also what is the right thing for that human being. And if they want this leadership and growth opportunity, who are we to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if that individual has an opportunity to make more of an impact somewhere else, you have to support that too. But just as an aside to all this, I agree with everything Carrie said, but this is an important thing to consider when looking at a search firm, if you're thinking of search firms. If you, search firms have understandably like ethical limits to who they can talk to based on who they've placed previously. So if you are working with a search firm that maybe works in your very specific field or is very local or whatever it might be, that pool of talent, they don't want it to cycle around, as we're saying, we don't want people to feel poached. So they are gonna, I've heard up to 3 to 5 years that they sometimes are not allowed to talk to them. So just an important thing to think about, is that search firm making sure you ask them what their restrictions are to candidates they can pull. If a candidate self-identifies themselves for the position, then can the search firm work with them? Typically, I think yes, but again, all important things because of that whole poaching conversation, search firms have their own restrictions too.
That's really helpful in the imagery that you gave there, Carrie, around an eye to the entire community and the shared benefit of keeping talent within the sector, which does sometimes mean movement, is really important. So I want to transition to the leadership profile that you talked about. And I know that you previously talked about this in another session. But I am wondering if you can review for us, in case there are new folks here, how to build out a profile like that and how to use that profile in your active search.
Yeah. So a key element of that leadership profile is beyond skill set, right? So if we if we take skill set kind of off the table, meaning like, someone who knows how to do QuickBooks, we just take like skills off the table and we think about attributes. Is this person a consensus builder? Is that the type of leader you want? Do you want a leader who's a big visionary? Do you want someone who's really adept at communication in terms of interpersonal communication? There's a leader that Lindsay and I have worked with. More than one person has said, I love how that person makes me feel, right? That there's no job description skill listed about how this person engages with other individuals and makes them feel. So it's, do you want in your leadership profile, do you want someone who's a driver, right? Do you want someone who is an empathetic listener? Like, it's all these things beyond, financial acumen, to really say, this is the type of person that we need. And add to that, Lindsay.
I was just going to say that we heard a great quote too about that someone said they always look for the things they can't teach first, and they start there, right? So so when you think of skills, you may not love finance and numbers, but you can learn QuickBooks, right? So like those are kind of teachable things. But, and I don't know who's all familiar with like a strengths finder, but that's how I think of those attributes. It's like, if it's embedded in you, you can't get rid of it. That's how you think, you process, and you can leverage it to do great things in your work. So, what are those attributes? But, it's back to the whole visionary thing too. Some firms will say the first thing they do is say, is this leader in their leadership profile expected to be that visionary for the organization? Or are they really expected to be the executor? They don't have a COO, they're doing the executing. So then the board's going to be the vision. And then the leader's going to be that executor. So I think all of those components are really, really important in the profile, right? To understand that expectation beyond just the day-to-day activities that the person might do.
Yeah. And, and I think I used this example last time, Danielle, but we worked with an advocacy organization that is more on the aggressive side, because they take their advocacy role, they're a P&A organization, protect and advocate role. They will say to themselves, they'll say, we're bulldogs. Like, we're going to go out and we're going to, we take our mission so seriously. So the leadership profile of that organization can't be someone who is more of that kind of, empathetic listener or consensus builder. No, they need someone who's going to be fearless. And so getting really clear that we need a leader who is fearless, who will take this role of advocacy so seriously that you're willing to sue your partner agency to protect the people that we serve. That's a very different culture and type of organization than another. And so that's why this leadership profile gets to the culture. It gets to the things you can't teach, as Lindsay said, and it really helps you identify beyond just the basics of, can someone read a balance sheet?
And I think we mentioned this in our session about, more about the profile, that they're very hard to interview for these things. So it's worth, there are reasons why companies, like I know Cardinal Health, for example, takes the Strengths Finder very seriously. They have those 5 on everyone's computer. They want to understand those attributes that you can't interview for well. Everyone's going to say they're a great listener. So, but are you, so I think, thinking about creative ways that you can get at understanding the attributes of candidates is important too.
Yeah.
It seems to me that this leadership profile is a good way to begin addressing the issue of equity in hiring as well, because we know that, there's this thought process around an organizational fit for a leader to an organization, and that there's opportunity for a bias if that fit isn't well defined prior to the search. It then is subject to a feeling that folks need to get when they meet someone in a boardroom. But if you've decided upon these characteristics in advance, it really does take a little bit of that bias out of the decision.
Totally.
So I have another question for you around I was really captivated by this concept of, what does your organization aspire to? And when you're thinking about building out the types of leaders that you'll be looking for, looking at those organizations. Can you describe for me how you would bring a board through that process of what do we aspire to?
Yep. So we believe succession planning is an element of strategic planning. And a big part of strategic planning is taking an organization from current state to future state. And so a big part of moving from current state to future state is getting clear on mission, vision, values, and the direction that you're headed. You know, what are you trying to solve for? And what ultimately is the change, right? So the best vision statements are not ones that are organization centric. To be the best, you know, food pantry in Ohio, like no, right? The best vision statement is that no one will be hungry, right? That's what you're driving toward. So when a board can get really clear on mission, vision, and values, and you have this really clear North Star for your vision, no one will be hungry. Then you can start to say, okay, if that's where we're driving, what are our priorities? And how are we going to get there? What are the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve to get to the place when no one's hungry? And so once you do that, then Danielle, then you can say, okay, now that we've agreed on here's our priorities and here's the outcomes we want to achieve. Now, who else is doing that? and who's doing it really, really well? So I think if you just say to a board, who should we aspire to be like? What other organization? I would venture to guess most boards are going to do things like, well, who's got a bigger budget? And that's an element, right? Who's got a bigger staff? And that's an element. But the most powerful is when you look at the outcomes. Who is achieving the outcomes? Who is moving the needle? Who is getting closer to no one is hungry? And that's the organization that we want to aspire to be. Who is cultivating a culture that they have very high staff retention, right? Who is cultivating donor relationships to the point where they have very high donor loyalty, which is why they're raising more money. That's the organization we want to be like. So I think you have to go through those strategic planning conversations with mission, vision, values as your lens. And then you can have that great conversation. Because if you just go to that great conversation, my concern would be they're going to go to really transactional things like budget size.
Lindsay, were you
And the things that are easier to measure, right? For a board, it's all, what's the easiest? It's easy to look at the budget size, it's easy to look at the staff. So, yeah, to what you said, Carrie, to me, it's who's getting the outcomes that you want, but then how are they getting there? Are they getting there because they fundraise well? Are they getting there because they keep their staff and they don't, they don't have that, rotating wheel of employees coming in, meaning that they can't ultimately make an impact in the same way because they can't retain their staff. So that's why we added that culture piece as a really important part of an aspirin organization, because building that culture can definitely lead to positive impact.
Absolutely.
I asked that question because I could see a board hearing that nugget of presentation and saying, okay, we're going to need to start an executive search. So let's jump into who do we want to be and, progressing through that. And what you described here is truly a longer term conversation that's somewhat ongoing, that I would imagine is a year or more in the making before you get to the point where you would do an executive search. So I think that's a really important call. And that continued strategic planning process that a board will go through is really important to this entire conversation.
And I think too, one thing made me think when you said that, Danielle, is this is another example of when you can look outside of your sector. I think too, when people are saying who's an Aspen organization, they automatically go to someone who works in the same space, who maybe serves more people or something. You can make, broaden it to someone who's making an impact with the culture and everything that we said. And it may not be in the same exact sector or field of work. Right.
That's really important. I'm sorry, it looked like you were going to say something, Carrie.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's really important. I think that we see more of that on the for-profit side. But we think sometimes within the lanes of service that we provide in the nonprofit side, but thinking through the characteristics, almost like you build out this leadership program profile, you build out an organization profile, and the components of that can be met in various different industries.
Right.
So that is the conclusion of the questions that I have today, and it's 11:14, so right on time. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was another great forum, and I've heard wonderful feedback from folks that this is going really well for them. They appreciate the materials, so thank you very much. Folks on the line, please don't leave without taking the time to complete the survey. Also, keep an eye out on the email you use to register for this forum for the post-forum materials. And as always, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.